Prologue: The Fragile Memory of Truth. In every age, human beings have tried to bury what they could not bear to face. Empires have burned libraries to rewrite history. Corporations have shredded evidence to protect their fortunes. Governments have erased testimonies to hide their crimes. Yet somehow fragments survive, fragile scraps of truth that defy the silence imposed upon them. The story of knowledge is also the story of its destruction. What endures through the flames and censorship often does so by accident or by the quiet courage of someone who chose to preserve what others wanted forgotten. Imagine a shepherd wandering among the cliffs near the Dead Sea. The year is 1947. The sun blazes across an endless landscape of stone and salt. Seeking shelter, the shepherd tosses a stone into a dark cave and hears the unmistakable sound of clay shattering. That single sound would echo across millennia. Inside those jars were scrolls, writings sealed away for 2,000 years, saved from fire, empire, and the passage of time. Their discovery would challenge long-held assumptions about sacred history, exposing layers of human revision and forgotten diversity. They had been hidden not for safety, but for survival. Throughout history, every truth that threatened power has faced the same fate. When something contradicts the accepted story, it is rewritten or erased. But sometimes an act of quiet defiance, a scientist hiding her notes, a cameraman burying his film, a witness secretly recording testimony, allows that truth to breathe again decades later. Each survival is a rebellion against oblivion. We live surrounded by archives, data centers, libraries, and digital clouds, all symbols of preservation. Yet history teaches us that information is not lost through time alone. It is lost through intent. Books burned not by age, but by decree. Films destroyed not by decay, but by command. The same pattern repeats. Something inconvenient emerges, and someone powerful decides the world would be better off not knowing. These stories are not conspiracies. They are human dramas of fear, ambition, loyalty, and conscience. The real mystery is not how secrets are created, but how a few manage to survive. From ancient scrolls in desert caves to hidden reels of forbidden footage, the journey of truth is one of improbable endurance. What survives tells us as much about courage as it does about corruption. In this series, we will travel through 14 stories of knowledge that almost vanished. Each one reveals a moment when truth came close to extinction, and the people who kept it alive. We will meet the shepherd who stumbled upon the oldest versions of sacred scripture, the scientists who smuggled forbidden research past authoritarian regimes, the journalists and witnesses who risked their lives to preserve evidence that governments and corporations tried to erase. Together, their stories remind us that truth, once buried, never truly dies. It waits for someone to unearth it again. Because in the end, every civilization faces the same question: what do we choose to remember, and what do we choose to destroy? The answers to those questions define not only our past, but our humanity itself. The Desert Scrolls, echoes from a silent library. The cliffs above the Dead Sea are quiet, barren. Winds pass over sun-bleached stone, and time seems to stand still. It was in this silence, in 1947, that a young Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat changed history by accident. He hurled a stone into a cave opening and heard something unexpected: pottery breaking. Climbing inside, he found clay jars sealed with wax and wrapped in linen. Inside them were ancient scrolls. These would become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest surviving biblical manuscripts in the world. But what made them revolutionary wasn't just their age, it was their content. These texts included familiar scriptures, but also alternative versions of stories many believed to be fixed and immutable. There were contradictions, omitted passages, and completely unknown interpretations, versions that had never made it into the canon. What had survived in those jars was not a single truth, but a chorus of competing beliefs. These weren't the edited, approved versions we see today in religious texts. These were raw, unfiltered voices from a time when Scripture was still being debated, shaped, and rewritten. The scrolls told us something uncomfortable, that what many consider sacred and unchanging was, in fact, once fluid, contested, and politically influenced. For decades, access to the scrolls was tightly controlled. A small group of scholars, hand-picked and guarded, held the exclusive right to study and release translations. Their progress was painfully slow. They were gatekeepers, filtering what the world could know. Only in the 1990s, when unauthorized photographs were leaked, did the wider academic community realize just how much had been withheld, and how much truth had nearly vanished under the weight of academic and institutional control. One scroll included an alternate version of the Book of Genesis. Another revealed a community with completely different interpretations of religious law. These weren't fringe ideas. They were once part of the active dialogue about faith and meaning in the ancient world. And yet, for centuries, those voices had been erased from the conversation. The scrolls were likely hidden for one reason: preservation. At a time when powerful institutions were consolidating religious authority and standardizing sacred texts, these manuscripts didn't fit the narrative. Someone, maybe a monk, maybe a scholar, recognized they would be destroyed and decided to bury them in the hope that someday someone would find them. That moment came 2,000 years later, not through a historian, but a boy with a rock. And because of it, we now understand that even our most sacred histories are not immune to revision and erasure. The scrolls survived the rise and fall of empires, but they nearly didn't survive modern scholars who feared what they contained. What does that say about us? That truth, even when buried, still calls out. That our understanding of the past is always partial, always shaped by those with the power to preserve or destroy. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a testament to forgotten voices and the fragility of memory. And they pose a haunting question: how many other truths were not so lucky? Sometimes what we know about ourselves doesn't come from what we've saved, but from what we almost lost. The papers that wouldn't burn, a corporate reckoning. It began in filing cabinets, rows of beige drawers in quiet offices stuffed with memos, research summaries, and correspondence no one was supposed to see. In the 1990s, a lawsuit pried them open. What spilled out shocked even the most hardened investigators. It wasn't just negligence. It was a deliberate, calculated cover-up, spanning decades, sanctioned at the highest levels. A major corporation whose name once stood for innovation and stability had known since the 1950s that its flagship product was deadly. Internal research had confirmed it. Executives had been briefed. The health risks were not abstract or ambiguous. They were fatal. The disease patterns were clear, the science solid. But instead of warning the public, the company crafted a different strategy: hide everything. A 1969 memo said it plainly: doubt is our product. The goal wasn't to prove safety, but to create confusion. By funding research designed to raise questions rather than answers, by attacking critics and casting doubt on evidence, the company bought time. Time meant profits. Profits meant survival, even if others didn't. Behind locked doors, researchers were told to shred documents. File rooms were quietly emptied. Entire studies were kept off the record, their findings whispered about but never published. Yet, despite it all, a few employees couldn't stomach the deceit. They made copies. Some were hidden in basement boxes. Others were misfiled in places no one thought to look. These scraps of evidence would become the smoking gun. When those hidden documents finally surfaced in court, they dismantled the company's long-standing defense. For years, they had claimed ignorance. The internal papers told a different story, one of full knowledge, cold calculations, and an unwavering commitment to profit over life. One memo discussed marketing strategies to target children, knowing the product would hook them young. Another revealed safer alternatives were studied and rejected because they would hurt the bottom line. The revelations weren't just a legal crisis. They were a moral one. Here was proof that large institutions could knowingly kill and lie about it for generations, and almost get away with it. The only reason they didn't? A few pages that someone, somewhere, decided were too important to destroy. The documents also offered something more insidious: a blueprint. They showed how to manipulate science, not by disproving it, but by distorting the public's understanding. Fund favorable studies, discredit critics, cast doubt on consensus, delay regulation. This playbook would be used again by other industries, different products, same tactics. What makes this story haunting isn't just the deaths or the lies or the billions made at the expense of human life. It's the narrowness of the escape. Had those hidden files not survived, had one person not copied a memo, had one drawer been emptied, we might still believe the illusion. Truth didn't emerge because the system worked. It emerged because a few individuals disobeyed, because someone recognized that silence would mean complicity. The secrets survived not because they were protected, but because someone refused to let them die. In the end, it wasn't a courtroom that saved the truth. It was a photocopier, a conscience, and a quiet decision to resist. The Buried Frame, a cameraman's last stand. It was 1971, and the war had been going on long enough for the world to stop asking questions. Most footage sent back to the public had been sanitized, edited, cleared by officials. But this time, something different happened. A small news team, following rumors of atrocities, embedded themselves in an active military zone. What they captured was not meant to be seen. The footage was raw: villages burning, soldiers firing into homes, civilians, women, children, the elderly, lying dead in the dirt. Screams echoed over the film's silent images. A journalist asked a commander if they had rules of engagement. The answer was drowned by the crack of rifles. When the crew returned, they were met by military officers. The film was seized immediately. National security, they were told. You can't release that. The reels were logged, boxed, and, officially, destroyed. But one man, the cameraman, had seen this coming. He'd made a copy, a duplicate reel, spliced and hidden before the handover. He buried it, quite literally, beneath the floorboards of a rented house and told no one, not his editors, not his family. For years it remained there, the film slowly decaying, the truth suspended in celluloid silence. Decades passed. The war ended. The official story held. There had been no atrocities. Survivors who came forward were labeled enemy sympathizers, their accounts dismissed as propaganda. The truth had been successfully erased, or so it seemed. As the cameraman aged, his health began to fail. Facing the end, he finally confessed. A journalist visited the house, pulled up rotting floorboards, and found the rusting canister. Inside was the buried film, brittle, water-damaged, but mostly intact. When it was restored and shown publicly, it shocked a generation that had been fed official denials. There was no longer room for doubt. The footage was authentic. Forensic analysts confirmed it. Veterans recognized the locations, the faces. Some broke down in tears. Others admitted they had been there. The truth that had been so thoroughly buried had clawed its way back through one act of quiet defiance. The government tried to cast doubt. Spokespeople claimed the context was missing, that it was old news, that it proved nothing. But the footage spoke louder than words. It wasn't edited, it wasn't exaggerated, it was real. And because of it, survivors who had been called liars for decades were finally believed. The official history had to shift, not because authorities chose to tell the truth, but because they could no longer deny it. That buried reel forced acknowledgement, if not justice. What's most chilling about this story is how close the truth came to vanishing. if the cameraman hadn't made a copy. If he'd hesitated or been caught, the footage would have been lost. The atrocity would remain a rumor, a disputed memory. Instead, it became undeniable. Truth doesn't always come in declarations. Sometimes it arrives decades later, unspooled from a forgotten film reel. This story reminds us that evidence can be fragile, but so can denial, if one person is brave enough to keep the record alive. Smuggled in silence, the scientist who refused to forget. The year was 1937. The air in Europe was changing, thick with tension, fear, and the slow closing of academic doors. A brilliant young scientist had spent years conducting research that challenged accepted theories, suggesting a new way of understanding the physical world. Her lab was modest, but her findings were revolutionary. Then the regime changed. The new government decided certain scientific ideas were no longer acceptable. Theories that didn't align with political ideology were labeled corrupt. Entire fields of study were declared dangerous. Books were pulled from shelves. Journals were purged. Scientists were told to revise their conclusions or disappear. She saw colleagues vanish. One day they were in the lab, the next they were gone. Some recanted. Others went silent. The institutions meant to protect discovery had become tools of suppression. She knew her work was next. She acted quickly. While officials prepared to confiscate research materials, she made copies. Handwritten notes, photographs, scribbled formulas. She sewed them into her clothing, tucked them inside hollowed books, and memorized entire data sets in case the papers were found and destroyed. When the time came to flee, she passed through border checkpoints with a suitcase, a calm face, and knowledge packed into her mind like contraband. Soldiers searched her belongings. Had they looked closer, they might have found the thin pages folded into the seams of her coat. They did not. Once safely abroad, she began again, reconstructing her research piece by piece. She wrote furiously, nights lit by a single bulb, trying to rebuild everything she'd risked her life to save. The findings were published under a new name, in a new land, and they took the scientific community by storm. Her work became the foundation for later breakthroughs, discoveries that would shape medicine, engineering, and physics. But what few knew was that it had almost vanished, not by the ravages of time, but by intentional erasure. The regime she fled succeeded in destroying the work of dozens of other scientists. They burned the wrong ideas. She had only escaped because she understood what was coming. Her preserved notebooks, now housed in a museum, still show the desperation in their pages. Formulas written in shorthand, diagrams squeezed into margins, pages torn from lab journals, folded and hidden. They are not only records of discovery, but of resistance. What's powerful about her story isn't just the science. It's the reminder that knowledge doesn't survive on its own. It survives because someone chooses to protect it. Against pressure, against fear, against power. In a world where ideas can be labeled dangerous, where regimes can decide what is acceptable truth, the smuggling of facts becomes an act of defiance. Her journey wasn't just a scientific migration. It was a rebellion against enforced ignorance. And so the memory of her work endures, not just in journals and textbooks, but in the quiet heroism of a woman who sewed her truth into her clothes and walked it to freedom. The hidden tapes, voices that refused to vanish. It was the 1980s, and somewhere in a sealed government building, truth was being boxed up. Not in metaphor, but literally. Cardboard cartons filled with testimony, names and details about a massacre no one was supposed to remember. The official inquiry had concluded, and the records were locked away. Some were later reported, lost in a fire. Others were simply never acknowledged again. But in a quiet office not far from the hearings, one man had been listening. He was a low-ranking investigator, tasked with observing the testimony sessions. What he heard left him shaken. Witnesses spoke of soldiers going house to house, executing civilians, torching homes, threatening survivors into silence. Some named their attackers. Others described the uniforms, the commands, the faces. These weren't rumors. They were first-hand accounts. The hearings were supposed to be confidential. No one was to speak of them publicly. Witnesses were sworn to silence. Many were later harassed, some threatened. A few disappeared altogether. The investigator realized the goal wasn't to uncover the truth, it was to contain it, so he broke the rules. Without permission, he began making duplicate audio recordings of the testimonies. Late at night, he copied tapes and labeled them with coded markings. He stored them in his home, behind bookshelves, in attic boxes, hidden among personal belongings. No one knew. Years passed. The official records were purged. Government spokespeople denied the massacre ever occurred. Survivors who tried to speak out were discredited. No evidence, they were told. The system had successfully buried the past, but the tapes were still there. Decades later, as political winds shifted, the investigator, now an old man, contacted a journalist. He handed over the recordings, shaky hands placing boxes of dusty tapes on a kitchen table. What they contained was undeniable. The original testimony, unfiltered, untouched, raw. Voices cracked with fear. Some trembled, others were angry. All told the same story. And then there were the parts not included in official transcripts. Questions from officials trying to steer testimony, thinly veiled threats, moments where witnesses were told to change their statements. The tapes were broadcast. The public heard what had been hidden. Pressure mounted. The government could no longer claim ignorance. Investigations were reopened. Survivors were interviewed again, this time believed. The hidden recordings didn't just preserve facts. They preserved context, the fear in a voice, the silence after a question, the weight of trauma unspoken but still present. They documented not just the crimes but the attempted erasure of those crimes. And all of it, every word, had been seconds from vanishing forever. Had one man not quietly pressed record, had he not hidden the tapes, there would have been no second chance. The massacre would remain officially denied. The victims would stay buried in both body and memory. Sometimes history is saved not by heroes in the spotlight, but by quiet men who defy orders behind closed doors. The investigator never sought attention. He simply couldn't bear to let the truth be silenced. And because of that, voices long buried were finally heard. The data they tried to bury, a researcher's quiet rebellion. It started in a trial clinic thousands of miles from public scrutiny. A pharmaceutical company was testing a new drug in developing countries, where oversight was minimal and the people involved had little power to object. The early results were alarming. Adverse reactions, unexpected complications, deaths. The drug wasn't just failing, it was harming patients. Inside the company, meetings were held. Memos were written. The conclusions were clear. Releasing this data could destroy the product before it ever hit the market. So, executives made a decision. The negative findings were buried. Only the favorable results, the ones that told a cleaner, safer story, were packaged for regulators. The drug was approved. It was sold globally, advertised as a breakthrough. Whoa. But one researcher, a woman who had worked closely on the trials, couldn't forget what she had seen. She had watched patients suffer. She had read the internal reports, the graphs, the side-by-side comparisons. She knew what the full truth looked like and what had been left out. When she raised concerns internally, she was shut down, warned, isolated. But before leaving the company, she quietly made copies. Patient files, internal emails, trial data. She kept them hidden, stored away in boxes that no one outside her closest circle ever saw. Years passed. The drug made billions, And then the deaths began in developed countries, places where the media asked harder questions and families could file lawsuits. Still, the company denied wrongdoing. They claimed the fatalities were unrelated, isolated, rare. That was when a journalist reached out. The researcher, watching the same story play out again, the same spin, the same erasure, decided enough was enough. She handed over the hidden data. The documents told the full story. They showed not just the dangers of the drug, but the company's awareness of them. Memos detailed decisions to suppress trial results. One note even calculated the cost of future lawsuits versus the revenue that would be lost if safety warnings were issued. The fallout was massive. Criminal investigations followed. The drug was pulled from the market. Executives testified before government panels. But for hundreds of families, it was too late. What makes this story so disturbing is not just the deception, it's how close it came to succeeding. Had the researcher chosen silence, the truth would have been buried forever. Regulators would have accepted the company's version. The public would never know what had been omitted. The preserved data was more than just numbers. It was a lifeline, a window into decisions that traded safety for profit. It reminded us that clinical trials are not just science, but stories with consequences. And in this case, one person's quiet rebellion made all the difference. She didn't blow a whistle on television. She didn't give speeches. She copied files. She waited. And when it mattered, she acted. The truth didn't survive because the system worked. It survived because one researcher couldn't forget the faces behind the data and chose not to let them be erased. The diary that lived in memory. A survivor's testament. She was just a teenager when the violence began. The streets outside her window, once filled with laughter, now echoed with gunfire. Her family went into hiding, and so did she. But even in the darkest corners of her makeshift shelter, she began to write. Not for herself, but for the world she feared would never know what happened. She chronicled everything, names of those who disappeared, patterns of attacks, the rhythms of death and silence. Her handwriting, tight and urgent, filled every page of her secret diary. It was a way to bear witness, a way to resist the silence that surrounded her. Each entry became a thread in the tapestry of memory she was weaving, one she hoped would survive even if she did not. Then one night, soldiers burst into her hiding place. They tore apart her belongings and found the diary. A soldier flipped through the pages, sneered at the descriptions of atrocities, some he had likely committed, and tossed the book into a fire. She watched it burn. In the detention center, she knew she might not live, but in her mind, she kept the diary alive. Lying awake at night, she recited each entry, memorizing names, events, even the emotion she had felt while writing. She built it again, word by word, inside herself. Somehow, she survived. When the violence ended, when the bodies were buried and the world moved on, she sat down with pen and paper and began to write once more. From memory, she reconstructed the diary. Not perfectly. Some dates were fuzzy, some details lost, but the heart of it remained. At first, no one believed her. Officials dismissed it as fabrication, too detailed to be real, too structured to come only from memory. But as investigators began to cross-reference her entries with other reports, the truth emerged. Names she'd written matched known perpetrators. Events she described lined up with mass graves. Survivors corroborated the stories she'd told. Her reconstructed diary became a crucial document in war crimes trials. It helped piece together the chain of command, revealed systematic planning behind the massacres, and proved leadership was involved. The words she had rebuilt in silence were now spoken aloud in courtrooms, forcing the world to listen. What makes her story extraordinary isn't just the courage it took to write the diary. It's the strength that it took to remember it, to hold it inside while surrounded by death, to recreate it not for vengeance but for truth. The original was lost, reduced to ash. But her mind became its vault. her memory its archive. In a world that tried to erase her experience, she rewrote it. And in doing so, she rewrote history. There are many ways to resist, but few are as quiet or as powerful as the decision to remember. Her diary didn't survive because it was hidden. It survived because she refused to forget. The suppressed report, intelligence that challenged war. It was written in a windowless room under flickering lights by an analyst who believed his job was to uncover the truth, not shape it. The report he compiled was dense, detailed, and damning. It challenged the entire foundation of a war that had not yet begun. He'd spent months reviewing classified intelligence, cross-checking sources, and assessing claims made by political leaders. What he found was alarming. The most urgent justifications for war, the weapons, the threats, the timelines, were exaggerated, unsupported, or outright false. The analyst submitted his report, believing it would help steer decisions away from catastrophe. But instead, it was classified, buried, and ordered destroyed. His superiors told him to revise it, to make the findings align with policy. He refused. They removed him from the team, reassigned him, and warned him not to speak of it again. But he had made a copy. At home, hidden in a box of old files, the report sat, untouched, unread, preserved. He watched from the sidelines as war was declared. As leaders stood before cameras repeating claims he knew had no foundation. As lives were lost based on intelligence he had proven false. When the war began to unravel, when the promised weapons failed to materialize, when the public began to ask questions, the analyst knew the time had come. He passed the report to a journalist. The world read what had been suppressed. The report detailed how senior officials had cherry-picked intelligence, elevating weak claims while ignoring stronger contradictory evidence. It showed how dissenting voices had been silenced, how the machinery of war had been greased with distortion. Government spokespeople scrambled. They called the report outdated. They questioned the analyst's motives, but they could not question the dates. The conclusions were drawn before the war, not after. The warnings had been there all along. They had simply been ignored. What made the report so devastating wasn't just its accuracy. It was its clarity. Line by line, it dismantled the narrative that had led a nation into conflict. And it proved that intelligence, when politicized, can become a weapon of its own. The analyst never sought fame. He didn't appear on talk shows or write a book. He returned to his quiet life, burdened by the knowledge of what could have been avoided. What he preserved wasn't just a document. It was a moment of conscience, a line drawn between professional obligation and moral responsibility. He knew the system would destroy the truth. So he saved it, quietly. This story isn't just about war. It's about how fragile truth becomes when it threatens power, how easily facts can be bent to serve a purpose, and how important it is that someone, anyone, chooses to hold on to the original version. Because without that hidden report, we might still believe the fiction. Artifacts in exile. The history they tried to rewrite. The excavation site was quiet, its dust thick with centuries of forgotten time. In the 1930s, a team of archaeologists began digging through layers of soil and stone at the request of a nationalist government. The goal was clear: uncover relics that confirmed a glorious and uninterrupted heritage, a pure history, a sanctioned past. At first, the dig yielded what they wanted: ancient tools, pottery, fragments of architecture. But then the narrative cracked. Artifacts began to emerge that didn't fit the story. Foreign influences, trade goods from so-called enemies, inscriptions in unfamiliar scripts. Evidence that history was not simple, but messy, interconnected, and diverse. When the lead archaeologist presented the findings, officials were swift. "These must be mistakes," they said. "You've misinterpreted them." He was instructed to discard or downplay anything that contradicted the official version. The past, it seemed, was only valuable if it told the right story. But the archaeologist refused. He knew what the evidence meant, that the nation's roots were not pure and isolated, but shared and complex, that the land had always been a crossroads, not a fortress. And he knew that if he followed orders, those truths would be lost forever. So he began to smuggle. Late at night, under the pretense of cataloging finds, he selected the most revealing pieces and wrapped them carefully. He stored them in crates labeled as personal belongings, then moved them out of the official archive. In a private storage room, he hid the objects: coins from distant lands, tools made with foreign techniques, hybrid artifacts that told a richer, more complicated story. Publicly, he was removed from the project. Officially, the problematic artifacts were logged as destroyed. The excavation continued, but only with findings that supported the approved narrative. For decades, the nation's museums displayed a curated version of history. School children learned a story of uninterrupted greatness, of cultural purity. No one questioned it, because the alternative had been successfully buried. Until the political winds changed. Now an old man, the archaeologist revealed what he had hidden. The artifacts, once concealed in personal boxes and forgotten corners, were brought into the light. Scholars examined them. The truth was undeniable. The objects told stories of trade and migration, of influence and collaboration. They revealed that ancient history, like modern life, was full of gray areas and blended borders. And they proved that the government's version of the past had been constructed, a myth built on absence. The rediscovered artifacts forced a national reckoning. Textbooks were revised. Museum exhibits were updated. Not because the system chose transparency, but because one man had preserved the evidence. History, we like to believe, is unchangeable, but what we remember is shaped by what survives, and what survives is often what someone chooses to save. These artifacts almost didn't make it. They were supposed to disappear into the soil, erased by decree. Instead, they returned to remind us, truth isn't always convenient, but it is always worth protecting. The tape that shouldn't exist, when a slip became a revelation. It was 1968. A live television interview was underway. The studio lights were hot, the atmosphere formal. A high-ranking official sat across from a journalist answering routine questions about defense policy. Then, in an unguarded moment, he said too much. Casually, as if discussing the weather, he confirmed the existence of covert government operations that had been denied for years. He named programs, locations, tactics. The interviewer, stunned, tried to press further. But the official caught himself, stumbled over his words, and quickly changed the subject. It was already too late. The interview hadn't aired yet, but it had been recorded. Technicians in the control room looked at each other, eyes wide. They knew what had just happened. Within the hour, government agents arrived at the station. They demanded all tapes. The official story was clear. The footage was a threat to national security. It had to be destroyed. The network complied. Reels were handed over, logs signed, recordings erased. The moment had vanished. Almost. One technician, working in the control booth that night, had quietly made a personal copy. Not out of malice, but instinct, a sense that what had just been said mattered. He took the tape home, tucked it away in an unmarked box, and told no one. For 30 years it stayed there, as headlines came and went, as the programs the official had hinted at continued to be officially denied. In the public eye, the operations remained conspiracies. The official story held firm. There was no proof, just speculation and rumor. Until the technician came forward. The official who had spoken was now dead. The political climate had changed. The technician handed the tape to a documentarian, and for the first time in decades, the truth had a voice again. The footage aired. Grainy, imperfect, but unmistakably real. The official's words rang out, naming what had long been denied. Analysts verified the tape's authenticity. Lip readers, voice experts, even former insiders confirmed it. This wasn't a fabrication. It was a forgotten truth. The government's response was predictable. They questioned the context, claimed editing, but they couldn't erase the recording. Not this time. What made the footage powerful wasn't just the content. It was the tone, the ease with which the official had spoken, as if everyone already knew. It revealed that what had been denied in public was accepted in private, that secrecy wasn't about protecting information, but about protecting power. This wasn't a leak. It was an accident. But it showed how fragile the line between secrecy and exposure can be, how even a brief lapse, captured and preserved, can unravel decades of denial. And it almost didn't happen. Had the technician followed protocol, that moment would be gone, another erased fragment, another gap in the record. Instead, it became proof. Not because the system allowed it, but because one person, with no agenda beyond curiosity and conscience, hit record. Sometimes the truth survives because someone quietly refuses to let it disappear. The survivor's decision. Memory as evidence. She was young when the killing began, a student, a daughter, a neighbor. Then everything changed. Her village turned into a graveyard. Friends vanished. The streets she once walked became traps. She found herself in hiding, but she refused to be silent. She wrote. Day after day, she documented what she saw and heard. Names, locations, times, patterns. Her diary became a witness to genocide, a voice in a world that had gone mute with fear. She hid it carefully, wrapping it in cloth, burying it in her belongings. It was her record, her resistance. But eventually, they found her. Soldiers stormed her hiding place. They found the diary. One of them read it aloud mockingly, laughing at the entries, some of which mentioned him by name. Then, page by page, they destroyed it. Flames swallowed her words, her truth. In prison, she faced death. But in her mind, the diary lived on. Night after night, she recited the entries to herself, memorized details, reconstructed the stories. The lines blurred between memory and ink, but she refused to let them go. If the pages had burned, she thought, then she would become the pages. Miraculously, she survived. When the conflict ended, she found paper and began writing again. From memory, she rebuilt the diary. Not word for word, but moment for moment, her voice returned. At first, no one wanted to hear it. Officials dismissed it as biased, imagined, flawed. They said memory couldn't be trusted, but investigators began to check her claims, and they matched. The names, the patterns, the places, they were all real. Her recreated diary became a key document in war crimes trials. It didn't just tell what happened, it revealed how. It showed chains of command, organized orders, methods of violence, and it proved that the massacre wasn't chaos. It was policy. What makes her story extraordinary is not that she remembered, but that she chose to. She carried trauma not just to survive it, but to testify with it. She didn't just live through horror, she turned memory into justice. Forensic psychologists later marveled at her recall. Experts validated her entries, but what truly gave the diary power was her unwavering insistence that truth, even reconstructed, was better than silence. We often think of evidence as physical, a document, a photo, a tape. But sometimes it's a voice, a mind, a woman who refused to let her story be erased. Her diary, burned and then reborn, now sits in an archive. It stands not only as a record of what happened, but as a monument to the human ability to remember what the world would rather forget. Truth, in her case, did not survive in ink. It survived in will, in repetition, in memory. And in doing so, it outlived those who tried to silence it forever. The analyst's copy, when truth was too early. Before the war, before the speeches, before the mobilization, there was a report. It sat quietly on a desk deep within the intelligence community, written by an analyst who believed facts still mattered. His task was simple: review the threat assessments being used to justify war. What he found was troubling. The claims being made in public about weapons, timelines, enemies, were not supported by the data. Much of it came from a single, unverified source. Some information had been deliberately taken out of context. Other reports, which contradicted the narrative, were simply omitted. He compiled everything into one report. Methodical, precise. It was not political. It was not personal. It was truth before truth had consequences. When he submitted it, the reaction was immediate. Not gratitude, suppression. His supervisors told him the conclusions didn't align with policy. They ordered revisions. He refused. Within weeks, he was removed from the project. The report was classified. All copies ordered destroyed. But he kept one. He wasn't sure why at the time, only that something about the moment felt wrong. That a truth this fragile shouldn't be left in the hands of people who had already decided it didn't belong in the conversation. He stored the copy at home. Years passed. The war began. The world watched as chaos unfolded. The justifications fell apart. The weapons didn't exist. The intelligence, it turned out, had been wrong, or at least selectively presented. And then came the moment. A journalist, digging into the early days of the conflict, found the analyst. He handed over the report. The public saw what might have been. A clear, evidence-based warning that had been buried. The report showed that the government knew its case was weak and moved forward anyway. Officials tried to discredit the leak. They called the analyst a disgruntled employee, said he was overruled, not suppressed. But the timestamp on the report told a different story. It predated the war. It anticipated the consequences. It had been right. What's striking isn't just the foresight. It's how close it came to disappearing. If that one copy hadn't been saved, if the analyst had followed orders or been too afraid, the report would be lost. Another erased warning, another missing piece. In courtrooms and hearings that followed, the report became a touchstone. Proof that there had been dissent, thoughtful, professional, ignored. And it reminded the public of something vital, that truth doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes it's too early. Sometimes it waits. And when it does emerge, it can reframe everything. The analyst never sought credit. He returned to his life quietly. But the paper he saved, the one he wasn't supposed to keep, became a mirror for a nation. Truth, he believed, doesn't always win, but it always deserves a chance. Epilogue: the silence. That failed. Across centuries, across continents, truth has always had its enemies. Sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they sit in boardrooms. Sometimes they speak softly from behind the safety of institutional titles. But their goal is the same: to bury what threatens power, to silence what reveals too much. And yet some truths survive. They survive not because the system protects them, but because someone chooses not to look away. A shepherd tosses a rock into a cave. A scientist hides notes in the lining of her coat. A cameraman buries a reel. An investigator presses record when no one is watching. Each of the stories we've explored could have ended differently. In most cases, they almost did. Documents were shredded, evidence burned, testimonies sealed and forgotten. What remains is a narrow band of memory, a sliver of what was almost lost forever. This is not a story of how truth always wins. It is a story of how often it doesn't. For every scroll that survived 2,000 years, how many were burned? For every secret report leaked to the press, how many vanished without a trace? We like to think we live in an age where information is permanent, where data is indestructible. But history whispers otherwise. It reminds us that knowledge is fragile, and truth even more so. It tells us that forgetting isn't always passive, it is often engineered. The stories in this series are not about conspiracies. They are about consequences. They reveal what happens when people in power control the narrative and what happens when they don't. They ask uncomfortable questions. Who gets to write history? Who decides what is remembered? What are we not seeing right now, in plain sight, that someone, somewhere, is trying to erase? These buried secrets matter not just because they reveal what happened, but because they show how it happened. They reveal a pattern, suppression, denial, revision. But they also show the cracks, the moments when an individual choice, quiet, risky, lonely, kept something alive. In a time when information moves faster than ever and trust feels more fragile than before, the lessons of these stories are urgent. Truth does not survive by accident. It survives through action, through resistance, through memory, and often through one person deciding that the silence must fail. So the next time you hear the phrase, "there's no evidence," remember, evidence doesn't always vanish on its own. Sometimes it's pushed into the dark. And sometimes, if we're lucky, someone lights a match and shows us where to look. Because buried secrets don't stay buried forever, not if someone refuses to forget.